The afternoon sun blazed as the boy, not yet 13, pressed on. It was 1952, and he had just started his job as a postboy delivering letters to a distant village twice a week. To save time, one day he took a shortcut through the mountains, and veering off his usual path, he stumbled upon an isolated spot. What he saw froze him in his saddle. The ground littered with human skulls and bones, bleached by time. Terrified, he raced home. Seeking answers, he approached his father. With a weary sigh, the old man recounted a scary tale from 20 years ago. As a new teacher, he had been assigned to a remote Kazakh village in Central Asia, only to find it eerily silent. No children were left alive. The man-made famine orchestrated by Moscow had driven people mad with hunger. The father spoke of the desperation, watching in horror as people scavenged for corpses at railway stations, and his family narrowly survived only on half a sack of wheat, payment for his work. When the famine ended, their village was decimated. It killed entire families, so often there was no one left to bury the bodies. Authorities wouldn't care, so the father gathered the scattered bones along the riverbanks, laying them in a makeshift graveyard. The boy would later become the father of a prominent Kazakh journalist, Yedige Magoin, who shared the story with the rest of the world. The Kazakh famine of 1930-1933, known as ashashlik, Kazakh word for famine, killed over 40% of Kazakhs, or more than 2 million people, making them a national minority on their own ancestral lands. Colonial overlords in Moscow hid the evidence about this crime for generations to come. The truth was out after Kazakhstan left the Russian colonial empire and declared independence in 1991. The public and the academic consensus formed that what happened was an act of genocide. Under public pressure, the government designated a memorial site for the victims. However, it took 26 more years for a monument to be erected. Why? Russian bullying. Since 2010, when Russian ruler Vladimir Putin first stated that any criticism of the Russian past, including crimes against humanity committed by Moscow during the Soviet era, is no more than Russophobia, it became the regime's main bullying tactic for the neighbors. By this logic, which Russia tested on numerous invasions already, fighting for international recognition of ashashlik genocide is Russophobic, and Moscow will have no option but to invade and protect Kazakh regions with Russian-speaking majorities, the majorities that were created by the events like ashashlik. Just look at what happened to Ukraine that dared to argue with this logic, the Kremlin line goes. Hi there, I'm Maxim Aristovia, Ukrainian journalist and author of the award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In it, I highlight a serial behavior that various Russian regimes used to justify their invasions of the neighbors. Painting the victims as Russophobic has always been part of the crime. This is Matryoshka of Lies, the Russophobia episode. So let's get back to the Kazakh genocide memorial in Almaty. It's February 2024, and many Russians are showing up there with flowers and candles. Qazaqstan became one of the main hotspots for Russian draft dodgers since 2022. Over 200,000 found here a permanent refuge. So, is this a show of gratitude to Kazakhs for sheltering them, and a long-delayed public remorse for the crimes committed in the name of Russians? Actually, no. Russian migrants turned the memorial for victims of Moscow-made genocide into a vigil spot for the slayed Russian opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. When many in Central Asia took offense at appropriating the monument in the memory of the person who publicly dehumanized Central Asians in numerous racist remarks, many ordinary and high-profile Russians cried Russophobia. In just one example, hundreds of Russians, including high-profile opposition figures like Evgeny Roizman, flooded with angry comments one viral Twitter X post, which got over 1.8 million views. In it, a prominent Kyrgyz sinologist, Aziz Toktobayev, criticized the insensitivity of such action. "No one asked you. Go F yourself. A chauvinist." These are some of the most polite comments by Russian social media users. Even as their country is committing another genocide, in the minds of so many ordinary Russians like these, they remain the primary victims. But if everyone's a victim, then who's left to be responsible for the crime?
In Kazakhstan, we're fighting to separate the commemoration of the famine victims, because this was a very specific tragedy, and then commemoration of all the people who died in the gulags or who were sent to gulags, because obviously that's a huge multi-ethnic, multinational human tragedy. But the famine was a very, like in Ukraine, it has a very specific history. We were not yet given enough time to mourn the dead from the famine.
Diana Kudaibergen is a prominent Kazakh researcher of colonialism and a sociologist at the University of Cambridge.
So now it's the first decade when people can talk about it, when there's more research into the archives. And when somebody comes in and says, well, somebody from Russia obviously comes and says, I can appropriate that monument to the victims of Ashatshuluk, the Kazakh famine. I can appropriate specific memory because we all suffered, during Stalinism, we all suffered. So, and there were a lot of people who died in that famine. But for the citizens of Kazakhstan, it's a little bit problematic that you're coming in and you're not researching this idea, not researching this topic, and you're trying to appropriate that space, or you're trying to basically coming with again, this is recolonization. You're coming in with your perspective from Moscow or perspective from any other big city, St. Petersburg in Russia, basically, and telling, I know what's best. This is my frame. This is how you guys need to commemorate it. This is how the memory politics should be done, because we all suffered. And I think that's what's problematic about it, is that you never listen to local voices and you're trying to bring your narrative as the most dominant and the right one. And how is this not colonial?
Just recently, the Kazakh public was shocked when a video of a corporate training leaked where a local company explains to new Russian employees who recently moved to Kazakhstan that when a person addresses you in the Kazakh language, it is not a Russophobic aggression. So it might be confusing for a foreigner to understand why speaking a native language or manifesting your indigenous pride is perceived as a threat by Russians. Dr. Kudaibergen explains to me that racism, at least when it comes to former Russian colonies in Central Asia, has a lot to do with it.
In Russia, you can take any of the city and they basically, the language is so normalized, but this particular language of racism is treating Central Asians as subhumans, as people who bring dirt, who are uncivilized. All of their traditions, all of our traditions, because I'm Central Asian as well, are barbaric, destructive to the great white Russian, civilization of the great Russian cities. And these people, these dirty, alien subhumans, are there only to clean streets, only to do all this tedious work that nobody else wants to do. And they should, they should be invisible as possible.
As we covered in previous episodes, the idea of a white colonizer bringing culture and progress to barbaric lands is integral to the fabric of Russian colonialism. So crying Russophobia is sometimes a racism-coded reflex too, channeling the fear of Russians losing their white imperial privilege. It's a Russian equivalent of a Western cliché of a white lady clutching her purse and crossing over to the opposite side of the street when seeing a person of color.
And that's definitely how I felt in Moscow when I was traveling there. I stopped after the invasion, obviously. But you come to Moscow, it doesn't matter. You always feel like you are invisible, and you always feel like you are treated incredibly differently. And that's how racism feels, is when people don't really think that you are human or that you're on the same level with them. No matter how well educated you are, no matter how great your Russian is, they always look at you as if you're not of their regard. They constantly racialize you.
But there is another reason behind the crying Russophobia tactic. Self-victimizing is part of the Russian crime of colonialism.
The imperial power dehumanizes the actual victim and claims to be the victim. When the victim opposes being attacked, being murdered, being colonized, the empire says that this is unreasonable, this is an illness, this is a phobia.
This is a 2023 testimony to the United Nations Security Council by Professor Timothy Snyder, one of the world's leading historians on Eastern Europe.
This claim that the victims are irrational, that they are phobic, that they have a phobia, is meant to distract from the actual experience of the victims in the real world, which is an experience, of course, of aggression and war and atrocity. The term Russophobia is imperial strategy designed to change the subject from an actual war of aggression to the feelings of the aggressors, thereby suppressing the existence and the experience of the people who are most harmed. The imperialist says, we are the only people here. We are the real victims, and our hurt feelings count more than other people's lives.
Okay, so if I suggest that it is a hate crime against the British or French and Spaniards to talk about their colonial transgressions, or, for example, it is an abuse towards an abuser to demand accountability from them, I'd be most likely universally cancelled. So why is there a different standard for Russia?
The use of the word Russophobia, the claim that Ukrainians are ill rather than that they are experiencing an atrocity, is colonial rhetoric, and it's a part of a larger practice of hate speech. That is why this session is important. In Russia's genocidal hate speech, the idea that Ukrainians have a disease called Russophobia is used as an argument to destroy them, along with the arguments that they are vermin, parasites, Satanists, and so on. Claiming to be the victim when you are in fact the aggressor is not part of the defense. It's actually part of the crime.
Okay, so we've covered racism, xenophobia, and the deflection of an abuser behind the Russophobia cry. Anything else is left?
I think they are threatened by the image of Russia not being great. I have noticed recently that they like to use great, even in the English language, for instance. Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, like the great Russian literature, the great Russian ballet. And and foreigners repeat these words without thinking that it's just an expression. I use this expression a lot myself before, and then I started to think, why is this word always sticks to the Russian things, to the Russian culture, to the Russian state?
Viktoriia Grivina is a Ukrainian writer. In the last 2 years, she has emerged as one of the most important Ukrainian voices documenting Russian colonial crimes.
And of course it is the empire that has not reflected on its own toxic and detrimental vibe and the danger that it poses for its neighbors. It thinks in the way that we need to be great. We have always been great. We have this great history. Children were taught that at school, that Russian history was great, and its history, and they study their history not by studying the indigenous Siberian tribes' history, for instance, but by studying Kievan Rus, which is in a different state. So it's a history of a different state, but they want to imagine themselves bigger than they are.
You know, it was a challenge to find the time for our chat with Viktoriia. She lives in Kharkiv, one of the most bombed Ukrainian cities by Russians. It endures severe blackouts and almost non-stop air raid alerts. This is what Friday, August 30th, 2024 sounded like in Kharkiv when Russians targeted the 1.5 million city with at least 5 glide bombs. The This is not the first time Viktoriia's home city is punished by Russia for being so-called Russophobic. This part of Ukraine suffered catastrophically from Moscow-made artificial hunger, the Holodomor genocide that started a couple of years after the similar one in Kazakhstan. It killed millions. In parallel, the Kremlin slaughtered most of the Ukrainian intellectual elites that were based in Kharkiv at that time, in the event that is now known as the Executed Renaissance. In her upcoming book, Kharkiv, the War City, Grivina paints a powerful picture of a defined city where the colonial spirit thrives in cultural events, poetry readings, and gallery openings, alongside air raids and explosions. She says that Russia is so obsessed with raising Kharkiv exactly because of this. After generations of historical and cultural erasure, Ukrainians can finally embody their own cities, villages, and homes with authentic stories that center their lives and not the colonizer. For Russians, this is Russophobia, but for Ukrainians, it's liberation.
I always thought about this TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story, where she wrote about her African childhood as she was reading British novels of the 19th century, like Dickens, for instance. And these are fascinating books and everybody reads them. But yeah, again, she dreamed of eating an apple, for instance, or drinking a ginger ale, something that, like, she had pineapples at her garden, like oranges and so on. But these were not interesting to her. And she imagined herself as this little white boy. And I was thinking, oh yeah, I kind of find a lot of things in common with this story.
From Kazakhstan to Ukraine, for centuries, the Russian colonial empire has masterfully shifted the narrative, labeling those who dare to criticize it Russophobes, nationalists, or even Nazis. This tactic has made equating the Russian aggressors with its victims a common practice.
Intriguing point of Russian colonialism is how quickly it can transform and hybridize from one point to another. Soviet Union can collapse, but it doesn't mean that the empire is gone. And then it takes a little bit of time to reconstruct itself. And then it's still an empire. It's a different type of an empire. And I think it's often seen in my writing as a zombie that is able to survive against all of the, against all of the weapons and against all of the fighting and struggles that it faces.
In her upcoming book, What Does It Mean to Be a Kazakhstani?, Professor Kudaibergen highlights how tragically little foreigners know about the people that Russia is or used to colonize, and how much of this knowledge is still dictated and controlled by Russian imperial propaganda. When you know so little, it's so easy to get shut down by a loaded Russophobia accusation.
So, Rewriting the Nation in Modern Kazakh Literature was my first book, actually, and it's based on the work that I've done when I came to the University of Cambridge and I was a student, and I go into this huge university library interested in finding what it has on offer about my country's history, about, not only the country's history, but also where I'm from and if it can tell me something. And it's a huge library. It's one of the biggest libraries in the world that possesses a lot of interesting books and files. And I was searching and I couldn't find kind of like a more comprehensive study specifically on Kazakh literature. There were a lot of interesting books, but there was no single source in English particularly where I could kind of like go into and find out about my culture. There was, volumes. You can go you could create a whole library on its own about Russian literature, for example. And then the project was to go back to Kazakhstan and to go through all the archives and try to trace back the history. And I have this one story I like to tell that when I was in the archive, in the Central Archive of Almaty, that had a lot of great collections and even signatures of the people who then were repressed and so on. There were a lot of missing pages in the archive itself. And there would be, for example, a lot of the transcription or minutes from the meetings in Russian. And then the typewriter or whoever was collecting this information would say, the meeting goes on in Kazakh. And then you will have basically pages or we don't know, maybe hours of information that was never recorded, because the typewriter or the people who were collecting it and ordering these notes were not as interested in collecting the information that was in Kazakh. So basically there I was sitting in the archives, surrounded by all of this knowledge, knowing that I only know, and I will only know parts of it because so much of it is gone, simply because people did not want to record it, or simply because they considered Kazakh language less important than Russian language. That idea of knowing that our history was not only lost or erased, as you say, but also it was always considered secondary, less important than the Russian canon, than the colonial canon. I felt, I felt traumatized by that. We have to work with so much. We cannot rewrite or reconstruct, but why do we need a crisis to be seen or to be heard? Why do we need a major colonial war to be put on the map and for people to have concern in the world about us?
This show is written by Yevkopiyka and Vlada Toporkova, produced by Elena Polyakova, mixed and sound directed by Anastasia Fedoskina, co-produced and narrated by me, Maxim Ristavi. This show is free thanks to so many people around the world who support the legacy Ukrainian journalism of Ukrainska Pravda. You can join their ranks too. Find out how at pravda.com.ua. If you like the show, please spare a minute to rate, comment, and share it. The Ukrainian production team creates every new episode against all odds amid bombings and blackouts, so this show has to trend, and you can make it happen. The empire will fall.